Well, events are absolutely boiling in the Middle East, as they have been for some time now. If possible, things have actually become worse. But we want to sort of catch up today concerning what's happened. We all know that a week ago last Thursday, this historic vote was taken at the United Nations. And at that particular time, the UN voted 138-9 with 41 abstentions to declare Palestine a non-member observer state, thus bestowing the officialdom of statehood upon Palestine. Even though Palestine at this time has no territory, they define the territory as pre-1967 borders, plus also East Jerusalem as the capital of this newly created state. So it's thrown everything into quite a whirl. How's it all going to end? What's it all going to mean? Let's just reassess for just a moment. Now, Israel is quite let down because many of the people that she thought were her friends did not stand by her in the time of need. Furthermore, President Obama did not stand by her. Now, I'm sure they would protest loudly that I would make such a statement. However, the bottom line is, if the United States had wanted to stop this new development, the declaration of Palestine as a state, she could have done it. If the United States would have simply said, you pass this resolution and we withdraw all funding from all UN activities, what would have happened? I promise you, they would have found a procedural problem or something why they could not at this time declare statehood for the Palestinians. But Barack Obama appeared to support Israel at the same time, allowing Israel to be thrown under the bus, as he has done several times so far. Now, let me make sure you get this clear. President Obama, with all of the might, with all of the influence of being the world's lone superpower, could have stopped this declaration of statehood. He chose not to use the leverage at his disposal. Now, it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago that this exact same circumstance came up, and the United States said, you do this, and all UN funding will stop. And guess what? They backed down. They would have backed down again because their precious world governmental system would have collapsed around their ears. They would have been unwilling to go to that extent. But President Obama was unwilling to do that. As a matter of fact, exactly what the UN declared is what President Obama publicly put on the table during the first part of his term, when he, for the first time, the only president to ever say that that Israel should withdraw to 1967 borders. He said that. It caused quite a rumble throughout Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu appeared before a joint session of Congress 5 days later and refuted it, showing why it could not happen, received 29 standing ovations. Nevertheless, Obama's back, and this time the United Nations passed exactly what he proposed, and that is that the negotiation terms be 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. It's the Obama administration that said that Israel should not be building one doghouse in the area of the settlements nor in East Jerusalem. You remember all that controversy during the first term of President Obama? Well, that's exactly what was embraced by the United Nations. They understood it. They understood that Obama was not going to go against the very thing that he himself had popularized during his first term. So that's what this is really all about. Even though he had the luxury of voting with Israel, and yet he was actually voting against the very stance that he himself had propagated. He just didn't want it done that way, or at least he didn't want to be perceived as being anti-Israeli, and consequently, it looks like he stood with Israel while the United Nations voted for the very thing that he promoted for 4 years during the first 4 years of his presidency. Well, it sort of makes you a little bit sick at the stomach. Nevertheless, that is in fact what has happened. Let me just give you, so that you do know, the nations that voted with Israel. They include the United States, Israel, the Czech Republic, Canada, Panama, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, Palau, and Nauru. Those are the states. Of course, the only significant states there would be the Czech Republic. That's a small one. And then Canada is rather important. The U.S. and Israel, the rest are very small states and don't have a lot of influence to offer. Nevertheless, their faithfulness and their friendship to Israel, I'm sure, was appreciated. And then there were those 138 that voted with the Palestinian Authority, plus the 41 nations that chickened out and did not take a stand one way or the other. So that's what we're dealing with right now. That's where Israel finds herself. She finds herself alone on an island with the United States, the Czech Republic, Canada, Panama, Marshall Island, Micronesia, Palau, and Nauru against the world. Against the world. That's where Israel finds herself. It's not an unusual place for Israel to be. She normally finds herself against the world, and she will find herself against the world at the Battle of Armageddon, because Zechariah 14:2 explicitly states, I will bring all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Now, one writer said this about the situation. He said, now that the damage is done, it is possible that something can be salvaged from this debacle. If and only if the Palestinians live up to the statements by Mr. Abbas that once the resolution was passed, he would return to the negotiating table with Israel. So this writer is saying, okay, he said he would negotiate once that the Palestinians were granted statehood by the United Nations. That now has happened. Oh, by the way, there's one opinion out there that the UN General Assembly did not have power to do this at all. And I'll take another day to go through that article with you detail by detail, because it was quite a persuasive argument and may in the end prove to be true. We'll have to wait and see how that actually goes. Now, in the meantime, though, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians, is proposing a 6-month negotiation with a settlement freeze. Now, he originally said that he would return to the table without conditions. However, now that he's saying we will return to the table with conditions, and that is a 6-month settlement freeze. We will negotiate for 6 months, and during that time, the settlements will be frozen. Here's just a little bit of what he had to say. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas on Sunday proposed holding negotiations with Israel for 6 months, during which time the Israeli government would freeze construction in the settlements. Abbas said that the negotiations would start from the point where they ended during the era of former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Now, this is, of course, not without preconditions. It has the maximum of preconditions. So where were the negotiations at the time that Ehud Olmert was forced out of office because of his charges of corruption that were against him? Well, the article goes on to say the negotiations would lead to agreement on the core issues and an Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 lines, he said. Now, wait. Abbas says these negotiations would end with Israeli withdrawal to pre-1967 lines. Well, why negotiate if you already know what the outcome is going to be? If this is all rigged, then why in the world do we even need to negotiate? Now, he backed up and he talked about where they actually stopped. He said, we could return to the point where we stopped during the era of the Ehud Olmert's government, when we put all the final status issues on the table. We reached many understandings on over these issues. Abbas said that the two sides reached understandings on the borders, Jerusalem, and the refugees. Now, Abbas is claiming that Olmert and himself reached understanding on the three biggest issues: Jerusalem, the refugees, and the borders. Now, Netanyahu knows exactly where those negotiations stopped. I don't know whether that's public record or not. When I have the time, I'm going to take a look at that. Nevertheless, Abbas is saying, let's go back and start where we left off. We were almost to a peace deal, Olmert and myself, and we had already agreed on where the borders should be, what the status of Jerusalem should be, and the refugees. Now, he went on to say the Palestinian Authority won't agree to return to the negotiations from point zero. Now, Netanyahu wants to negotiate without precondition. He says that Israel is willing to make painful compromises. Exactly what Netanyahu has in mind, we don't know. But he has said he believes he will be the person that will conclude a peace deal with the Palestinians. Now, the reason this is such a big deal is because it has direct effect on one of the 5 greatest prophecies in the history of the world. Now, let that soak in for a moment, because it's awful easy to involve ourselves in exaggeration when I say that this has direct impact on one of the 5 greatest prophecies given in the history of the world. That's a huge statement, and it's my opinion, of course. But of all the prophecies that I know of, this is one of the 5 greatest. And it may interest you to know, since Abbas said that he and Omer had already reached agreement on where the border should be and what the status of Jerusalem should be and what should be done about the refugees, that means that they had already reached agreement, number one, on the borders. That's prophetic, because Jesus himself prophesied about Judea being under the control of the Palestinians 3.5 years before Armageddon. So they had discussed that. What they had decided, I do not know. I do know how this ends up. Secondly, the status of Jerusalem, and the Bible does prophesy about the status of Jerusalem and how that's going to be decided when a Middle East peace agreement is finally reached. And then refugees, particularly Jewish refugees, we know how that's going to end up. The Jews, many of them, are going to refuse to leave their homes in the promised land of Judea, Samaria. So they're going to live there under Palestinian control. And that will work out fine for 3.5 years. And then something will anger the Palestinians. They will unleash an unprecedented slaughter against the Jewish people, so that the Jews will have to run for their life. Some of them will make it out. Some of them will not. So that's what we're dealing with here in this whole situation. Now, when we come back, I'm going to take the time to outline for each of us exactly what's going to happen when this all boils down. Regardless of what you're reading now, we know where this is going.